Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In this series of episodes, we're talking about the evolution of our waterfront. And we began in episode 1 talking about how the first explorers, Spanish explorers and others, saw the wonderful bay and water area that we had here and reckoned in their minds how this could be used for trade and for defense. This story carried on, of course, through several different flags, the Spanish, the French, and then we concluded our story in episode 1 by talking about what the situation was like when the war between the states began here and how tentatively, Pensacola would have been, could have been, might have been a great source for the South had they been able to, had the Southern military forces been able to command all of the military fortifications here. But of course, that did not happen. And as a result of that, the Southern troops evacuated the area. The railroad, which had been completed here in 1861, was torn up. And we went through a decade of sort of desolation. And when the people came back at the end of the war, Pensacola was like the rest of the South. It was on its economic knees. But then something wonderful happened as far as Pensacola and South Alabama and the area of all of Northwest Florida came to be. This came about because in Europe, where the Industrial Revolution had been fostered some 75 to 80 years before, the original manufacturing cities had been overgrown. They had become slums. And now, through events that had transpired in France and Germany, it was recognized the Industrial Revolution was real. It was going to continue to exist. And so people in those countries, France, Germany, England, of course, and Scotland, recognized that the cities had to be redone, rebuilt, expanded, and to do that required a large ongoing supply of quality building materials. And by happy chance, this area, Northwest Florida, South Alabama, was sitting upon about a 125 square mile area of virgin yellow pine that had hardly been touched through all of the years of time. And so immediately, beginning late in 1869 and 70, the lumbering era for Pensacola began. And as this happened, again, by great chance, several things just began to fall together. First of all came the first great order for lumber from Europe. And by happy chance, the Simpson Mill, which of course was not Escambia County, but was over on the Blackwater, it had just been reconstructed, rebuilt after its wartime destruction. And the Simpsons were able to take on the first great orders for lumber. Now, immediately, when it became obvious that the French, British, and others were going to create a new market, people with capital and lumbering know-how began to come to Pensacola. These were men and companies who had operated successfully in the Carolinas, in Maine, in Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and those forests had largely been cut over. So these people came down here, brought their know-how, and they began to take advantage of this great forest that we had. And I won't go into the detail of how they acquired the rights to cut, but they did over huge areas, 100,000 acres, 150, 200,000. And these mills were located all over the Northwest Florida area, well up into Alabama, into Brewton and that area. But here, right in Pensacola, along the waterfront, that change was taking effect as well, and in several ways. Number one, by happy chance, the local people, led by the city council in this case, were in the process of rebuilding the railroad that had been destroyed during the Civil War. And in the middle of 1870, what became known as the Pensacola and Louisville Railroad was reconstructed and began operating between here and the new terminus in Alabama, which of course became Flomaton Junction. And of course, that railroad hooked onto the growing L&N system, so that we now had a direct access by rail out, or rather to and from, the port of Pensacola. Number two, at that same point, of course, the ships that were going to come in here to handle the transfer of lumber manufactured here began to require additional fittings and services. And these ships were largely small. They were mostly from Scandinavia, 400 to 500 tons. They came here in ballast. That is, they were ballast as they came across the Atlantic with rock, largely granite rock. And when they arrived, the rock had to be disposed of. At first, it was just literally carried by wagon over into what we today call East Hill and was dumped there. But then the people realized that was slow and costly. So one of the firms locally got a contract to unload that rock and place it in the water right at the water's edge, right along what we today call Main Street. And they would put down the rock, then they would bring it to a certain level, then they would cover that with clay and then with sand. And so block by block by block into the 1880s and 90s, we created new land for the southern part of our city, which of course became a part of commerce there. At the same time, of course, the new railroad made it possible to do something else. Because now, not only did we have the railroad moving north, but by manufacturing genius and science, we now had companies here who were able to commercially produce ice. Now, when you had a railroad and you had ice, now it was possible for commercial fishermen to go out into the Gulf, take advantages of the large banks of snapper and grouper and other table fish. They could bring that material in, trim it, clean it here in a fish house, and then they would pack it properly and send it north on the railroad to places like Cincinnati and Louisville. And so a whole new industry developed. Now, to take care of those fishing smacks, which of course began sailing out of here in 1870, you had to have what they called a fish house, a base for this. And the first one of this, first base was for the Sewell Cobb Fishing Company, and for this the Cobb people leased the west side of the Palafox Street dock. And this is where Cobb's fishing smack would dock, and this is where the fish house was located, and that became part of the new industry in the bay, carrying the fishing story forward. 10 years hence, in 1880, Andrew Fuller Warren arrived here, and he opened his fishing company, basically a copy of what Mr. Cobb was doing, except that Mr. Warren's company was based on the Balin Street dock, and this is where his fish house was, and of course where he docked his fishing smacks. A year later, still another company, this one led by a man named Eugene E. Saunders and Captain Thomas Wells, went into business. They too leased space on the Palafox Street dock, so by the time we reached 1882, you had 3 different companies, all utilizing 2 or 3 masted smacks, and by that time there were more than 60 such vessels here going out into the Gulf, making their catches, bringing them in here, treating them, and sending them north to northern markets. So we had a whole new fishing industry. Well, going back to lumbering now. The lumber mills, many of the lumber mills, of course, were located up country, up the Blackwater River, up the Escambia River, but 2 in particular located right here in downtown Pensacola, right at the foot of what we today call 10th Avenue. The Ricks Robinson Lumber Company was opened. It was a large firm. Timber, basically the timbers were floated down the Blackwater or the Escambia River, towed here to their dock, and this is where the timber came inland, was dressed into lumber by the Ricks Robinson Company, and the Robinson firm built its own dock right out into the bay, and of course vessels coming from Europe would pull in, stop at the dock, be loaded, discharge their ballast rather than then be loaded, and this was a new part of the operation. And about just a year later, a second firm was built. This about 3 blocks to the east along the bay. This was the George Washington Wright Lumber Company. The operator was the son of the man who had come here some 70 years before and who had been our first newspaper editor. But anyway, young Mr. Wright opened his mill, and it went on through 2 generations to be a great success. And like Ricks Robinson, Wright built a pier right out into the bay, and consequently that became a new part of the waterfront. Well, about this same time, of course, railroading was just beginning to blossom. We talked about the Pensacola and Louisville, which had been completed in 1870. 3 years later, a short railroad, the Pensacola and Perdido, was built between Pensacola's docks, or the waterfront, and the city of Millview, the town of Millview, over on the Perdido. And the P&P, as they called it, came into Pensacola, got right down Main Street, and they built a dock out into the water so that they could handle lumber being carried from the Millview area to Pensacola and put on board ship for export. So that was the second one. Then in the 1880-81, we got still another railroad when the L&N backed a new line that was to be built from Pensacola to the east this time. This became known as the Pensacola and Atlantic. The P&A joined, it went as far as the Chattahoochee River, where it linked up with another railroad moving out of Jacksonville coming west. So we had a line still clear clear across the Panhandle. But in addition to that, now the P&A built a new large railroad passenger depot on Wright Street, and then they built a line, a freight line that came right down what we today call Tarragona Street, and which for many years people called Railroad Street. The P&A trackage came right down to the bay, and this is where they first of all built a small dock. But went just a few years later, their general manager was a very far-sighted gentleman by the name of William Dudley Chipley. And Chipley had a dream. He could see that the whole South was just beginning to grow dramatically, and he could see that the United States would profit by having a canal, an inter-ocean canal, cut across Nicaragua. And Chipley and many others felt that this was the answer, this was going to happen. And so Chipley, using his foresight, went to the board of directors of the Louisville and Nashville. Of course, they were in New York, and talked to Augustus Belmont, who was the chairman of the board, and convinced Belmont that the new canal was going to be built, and that we had to be ahead of the curve by building facilities for the railroad here. And so they got the money, and this was when they began to build the new docks at the foot of Commandencia Street and Barrack Street. They built docks and warehouses, which at that point in time were the state of the art, and they continued to improve these docks and warehouses over the next 10 to 15 years. At the same time, Chipley, as we reached the year 1889, Chipley had been instrumental in putting together the company that would manufacture fertilizer here to improve agriculture throughout the area. And so he recognized that farming and farm commodities, and particularly seed grains, were going to be passing through the port in large quantities. And you couldn't do that without a grain elevator. So Mr. Chipley, again, went back to the board in New York, got a subsidy from them, and they built a beautiful grain elevator just adjacent to the little rail yard and the Commandencia and Barrack Street docks on the lower part of the waterfront. So now we have the grain elevator, we have our two beautiful new docks, and now almost at exactly the same time, the city begins to see the influx of more and more vessels that are coming here powered by steam. And of course, the steam is generated by burning coal. Now, this happens at Pensacola because by now the railroad has managed to run its trackage well into central Alabama. And in central Alabama, of course, there were coal fields. So now those lines that line begins to bring coal as a product down to Pensacola, and it is used in two ways. Number one, it becomes an export item. Pensacola being the export scene for coal going basically into the Caribbean islands. And secondly, of course, more and more of the vessels are burning coal, and so we had to have a way to load coal both for export and for bunkers. And so at this point in time, in the mid-1890s, the L&N builds something still another facility. This one again is reached by running a separate track away from the depot, going to the southeast to about the 16th Street, and they put in what became known as the Muskogee Coal Tipple, the railroad coal tipple. And this is where it was a long line. It was a pier, basically, ran 1,600 feet out into the water, and at full tide it could handle 6 vessels at one time, all loading coal. And that tipple, of course, was a tremendous boon to commerce here, in both in the basic trade of coal and also in servicing the vessels. Now that coal tipple would serve here until the early 1950s, when unfortunately it burned. Today, we're looking at the 21st century. What remains of the coal tipple is the old standard, about 1,600 feet out into the water. And of course, on the inner side, right on the very shoreline, developers have purchased that property, and now they have a new residential area, a 13-lot residential area called Muskogee, and they are in the process now of building quality, wonderful homes right there. So you can see how quickly that the whole site of the old view of the whole waterfront was changing with the coming of fishing, lumbering, shipping, and all of the things that went with it. Pensacola was really changing on the waterfront.